Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session, and thanks for tuning in. My name is Kees from Bochove. I'm the founder of the Hyve, and today I would like to take you through the topic of fair data and the trend of data lakes. Just by way of introduction, the Hyve is a company that focuses on enabling open science, and we have essentially two types of services. One has to do with implementation of open source solutions, and we participate in open source communities like Radar and Open Targets and CBioPortal and Odyssey. And the other one is what we'll be focusing on today, which is verifying data and a fair data strategy. And so if you think about that, there is the why. So why bother with fair data? We have how do you roll it out? And I also want to spend a few minutes on how do you know which data to make fair, or what data are worth your investments? Where do you invest? To start off, I would like to put as a why that fair data solves a business problem, and an important one at that. If you read a book like this and some other books that are commenting on the current innovation landscape, clearly data is on everyone's mind, and the companies that are best positioned to harness their data, make use of the knowledge that they have and that's out there in the world, they're the ones that are most successful. And I don't think biopharmaceutical companies is an exception. And indeed, we do have our CEOs going on stage saying that we are becoming a data science company, or we have an important data strategy. But really, when you're talking about data, what problem is fair data solving? And I would like to summarize it like this. I think this is one of the ways to look at it. From an application perspective, there is an increasingly fast turnover of application. This definitely is the case in research, where I don't know what is the average lifespan these days. Is it 18 months, 2 years? Then an application actually is used before it's phased out again and replaced or merged with some other system, etc., etc. So you have this very kind of high-speed, volatile space where you have new data platforms and new data science toolkits coming out all the time. But then on the other hand, from a data perspective, what you need to know and all the information you need to retain also for regulatory purposes leading up to something like an NDA or a BLA that's perhaps even in some cases dozens of years of data. So you have this dichotomy between the lifespan of applications that produce the data, which are often phased out, and then the actual assets themselves that have a much, much longer lifespan. And fair data really helps address that particular problem. FAIR didn't really start out that way. It started out as a movement in open science. And actually tomorrow I have a talk that's more open science geared. But it has been, especially in the last 2-3 years or so, become a really core element of many of biopharmaceutical companies' data strategy. And I think one nice pivotal moment that we had was this workshop that we organized at the Hyve in Utrecht with the Pistoia Alliance, and where many people from across the industry that care about this topic joined. And we produced a paper, as you can see here, but we also started, perhaps more importantly, a fair data working group in Pistoia Alliance that still continues today under the leadership of Ian Harrow. So one of the things that we did at that meeting, and that we are still operationalizing and interpreting for specific settings, is how do we take these principles, which really are more generic data management principles, and make them actionable for the specific company setting or data setting that we focus on. And I want to take just one example through the lens of those 3 different pillars of Go Fair, go change, go training, go build. where it addresses respectively the culture aspects, but also the skills aspects. What do we have in order to train people to get on this FAIR, to get on board a FAIR train, and finally the technology piece of it. So the example I want to take is F2, which states that in order for data to be fair, they need to be described with rich metadata. If you think about it from a lens of change management, what this really means is that you need to adapt people's mindset, but also the underlying business processes to systematically capture metadata, which isn't always obvious. A lab instrument often is set up to produce the actual data set in great detail and has formats for that, etc., but doesn't necessarily have standards to capture the metadata. What was the operator, who was the operator, what was the instrument, what were the pipelines used, etc. From a skills perspective, you need to work with the experts to define what do we consider important metadata elements and how do we standardize those across the company, so that if we refer to, let's say, the project context, we all use the same identifiers for projects. Not an easy challenge to solve in a farm environment where you have multiple mergers and acquisitions and changes all around all the time. And then from a technology aspect, even if you've agreed on those metadata standards, if they are not created in a machine-readable format that's interoperable, machines still wouldn't be able to leverage it. So you may also want to tap into things that may be already there, like master data management services. And if you do that, what you get out is really the bridging the operational view of, in this example, an ELN, where people day-to-day are putting in data and generating templates, generating fields, entities, etc., and being able to convert that into a strategic, if you will, knowledge graph view on a number of key entities that underlie these business processes and aren't that subject to change. I mean, the notion of what a program is or what a project is, yeah, there may be subtle differences, but by and large, you can and should standardize this across the company if you really want that strategic view on your data. All right, so I hope to have shown that really you should invest in FAIR data because it solves an important business problem, which is being able to tap into the data which are touted as critical business assets that form the competitive advantage of the company. And by doing that, you also address the gap between sort of operational software systems that come and go and the long-term data view. And you need, but also support change management by doing that. All right, that was the why. But how do you do it? So an interesting view on this is that data integration and trying to consolidate it in one place and making it available for the company is nothing new. And we used to have enterprise data warehouses for this, where you had a place to put all the data and you had these ETL pipelines that went into it, and you then can build business intelligence applications on top of this. And this pattern is still very much in use throughout companies. But the issue that often you encounter with this setup is that enterprise data warehouses get these really intricate schemas that after a while, only a few people know how to maintain and how to read them. And so a little bit more modern approach is that, no, we're not building one giant data warehouse, but we are building a data lake where we just put all the data assets. So that's one way to get data in, is just self-service. However, also there you see that often there's then an ingest team started because we need to have the legacy or previous data assets in. Also in order to show the value in the first place, you need to rewrite the pipeline so that they actually put data in the data lake. And so you need a platform API to support that. But not only, you also need a data engineering team that helps with building these ETL services and pipelines. And you need an ingestion team that oversees all the data assets and what have we ingested yet. You need a search team that allows you to be able to take advantage of the fact that it's in one leg by building search applications on top of it. But that, of course, can't function without a unification team that make sure that the data is really integrated and that you can combine data sets with each other in the lake. And in order to take advantage of that, you also need an analytics team. So before you know it, you have all these teams created. And now it looks like you've divided the data integration up in more parts than with the enterprise data warehouse. But really, if you think about it, this is an architectural division. So it's different IT teams or data teams, but it's not a business division. From the business perspective, this just looks like one monolith. And if I need to change one thing, let's say, there is a new data type that's being generated, I actually have to go through all these teams, to perhaps change the API if needed. Definitely with the unification team to create this new model, build new dashboards with the analytics team to take advantage of the new data set. So all in all, you've more or less created, again, some sort of a monolith, a central function. And in principle, there's nothing wrong with central functions. But the thing is that if your application architecture doesn't match your business processes, then, as we know from Conway's law, for instance, you're in big trouble. It's just not going to work if that is not aligned to how the company really operates. And so what I would propose is a bit more nuanced approach. Of course, I'm making contrasts here, but I would propose to decentralize the data management where possible. So how could that look like? You start with defining identifier schemes that you want to use in a company. You start thinking about these metadata standards that I mentioned earlier, and also provenance standards. And if you do that, you essentially have the brief of a chief digital officer or chief data officer, a data office that looks at data governance across the company. So these are the things that you do need to centralize. But after you've done that, you can essentially take those standards and hand them to the various departments and say, look, here is how you can implement them. And you can also grow together with the departments and go domain by domain and incorporate, for instance, more and more of their aspects in the metadata standards. You go around to your therapeutic areas, your platforms, preclinical development, etc. And you allow them, using those standards, to publish their data assets. So you still need some sort of a data catalog, but now it's decentralized rather, or federated, rather than assuming one data lake where everything is put in. So the advantages of this approach are numerous, because for one, this is much more resilient to change. You know how it goes in the industry. You have mergers and acquisitions. You have funding that gets reallocated. Budgets that change. So here, you're not dependent on one big sort of change management effort across the company or one big team that has to do it all. Rather, you tap into teams, and that allows for an iterative data strategy, where you can start with, let's say, one TA or one supporting function. You make sure that they have the tools to make data fair, and then you go in from there. Another advantage from a skills perspective is that you don't need to sort of hire in a lot of expertise or sort of pillage the company for all the informatics and data experts that you can find, but you let them stay in the teams where they are, and you empower them to make data fair according to these sets standards of the data office, and you make sure that they have what they need. So one very popular service, for instance, these days is to help writing fair playbooks that equip people with very concrete means. If I'm an architect, if I'm a software developer, how should I design my API in order to make sure that the data is fair? And this way, you actually empower the teams rather than kind of say, okay, I'll do data management for you, because that's not how things work. And that will never, in my view, really, in the end, align with a sustainable data strategy. Last but not least, this decentralized approach also makes it much easier to tap in external data sets. if you have external data, that's fair, and that's increasingly the case in biomedical data fields. Because you're relying on a set of standards and practices, it's much easier to bring that into the fold rather than if you have locked yourself into a large data lake or a data science function that does all this. So to summarize this point of how you should do things, I have a view on it, which is that it's better to decentralize where you can and have a small, standardized, centralized effort which really focus on standards. Things like URI patterns, metadata standards, etc., data standards. All right. So a few minutes also on the where. One of the services that we provide at Hyve is what we call data landscaping. And we've done this a few times now where we, for a certain scope, which could be as big as all of R&D in a big pharma, look at what data assets do you really have? There's potentially thousands of IT systems, databases, file stores, but what kind of data is where? And what really helps there is a process view. I like this one from NIH NCATS, which gives you a sort of harmonized process view of the drug discovery, development, and deployment process. And this is really the same in all the pharma companies I've seen, more or less, that if you do small molecule drug discovery, this is what it looked like. And you have your lead identification process and your high throughput screening. And so tying this process view to the actual underlying systems, that gives you the first view on what data is out there. However, that's just a piece of the puzzle. And if you're interested in this piece, you can check out what my colleagues wrote about this. Suki wrote a blog on data landscape. And also there is a nice video which shows you an example of such a data landscape. But once you've established what data do we have, then come the real hard choices. And my point here that I want to make is that really should be driven by your purpose. Is your purpose a management tool, knowing what data there is in a company and how can we streamline that? Is it an AI ML goal where you perhaps want to take some of the information assets to start doing drug development and design in silico? Is that a data integration purpose where you had a number of large data integration functions that you now want to sort of decentralize and implement the FAIR principles? There can be lots of purposes. So knowing what your purpose is and whether that is an operational or strategic and how you can measure when it's successful, that's of course really the key. But then also you're faced with other questions like, should we invest in retrospectively going back into, we have decades of clinical trials data. Great. Should we verify that? Does that serve our purpose? How does it balance out against investing in better data management processes going forward? And this is especially, I think, attractive in the lab space where you can do a lot with lab automation and FAIR to generate data which are fair by design. Another aspect is the quality of the data. Are these data sets really worth going back to? There are tons of examples where there's a really low chance that you will ever look back at these data sets. So then it may not worth investing into verifying them. And another axis is, this is linked with your purpose. Are you looking for short-term rewards or the long-term rewards? And I think the long-term rewards of FAIR are much greater. But of course, in today's kind of stock market driven environment, that's not always an easy message to give. So you have to think also about what do we get out of this short term? And that ties into another aspect, which is, do you invest into making data fair or do you invest in the culture? Right, so lots of questions, and I don't have the time to go into any of those topics in depth today, but I want to point out that we do have a number of services at the Hyve that can help you really to find out what is the right strategy and where is the valuable data in the company, which is data landscaping, as I already mentioned, but also things like creating semantic models, verifying the data maybe in parts of the companies and start getting some of those metadata standards and URI standards out. So these are things that we can help with. In conclusion, I hope that I've shown that fair investments really should start with what is the purpose, and that my personal belief is that the long-term value of FAIR really trumps kind of the short-term outcomes that you have. If you're interested to find a nice example of, well, how can you show a success story of FAIR and some of that long-term investment over a few years even come to fruition, I would recommend tuning into my talk tomorrow, which will provide an example of COVID-19 Odyssey Studyathon, where we do a regulatory grade study in just really a few days, thanks to FAIR. Thanks very much for tuning in, and I'm happy to discuss further with you in the panel.